The morning began like any other, wrapped in the soft illusion of permanence. Light filtered through the thin curtains, gentle and forgiving, touching the walls as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong. Outside, birds called to one another in ordinary joy. Somewhere in the distance, a vendor's cart rattled over the street stones, a familiar sound she had heard 1,000 times before. Life was moving forward, unaware that it was about to fracture. The mother stood in the doorway of her child's room, watching the small chest rise and fall. She did not know why she lingered longer than usual. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps the heart already knows what the mind refuses to imagine. She brushed a strand of hair from the child's forehead and smiled. That quiet smile reserved only for moments when love feels too large to be spoken. "If only I had known," she would later whisper to the empty air. But at that moment, she knew nothing. She turned away to begin the rituals of the day, washing rice, boiling water, folding yesterday's clothes. These small acts had always anchored her, giving shape to time. In Buddhism, it is said that ordinary moments carry the deepest teachings, but she had not yet learned how fragile those moments were. Then came the sound. It was not dramatic. No thunder, no shattering glass. Just a sharp cry from the next room, followed by a sudden silence that felt heavier than noise. She froze, the ladle slipping from her hand, clattering to the floor. Her heart tightened, as if gripped by an unseen fist. She called her child's name once. Then again, no answer. When she reached the room, the world tilted. The small body lay still, impossibly still, as though time itself had stopped breathing. The child's face was peaceful, almost serene, but that calm terrified her more than any scream could have. She touched the child's cheek. Cold. In that instant, something inside her shattered. Not loudly, but completely. The mind searched desperately for explanations, for mistakes that could still be corrected. This must be a dream, she thought. A cruel dream that would end if she shook hard enough. She shook. She begged. She screamed. But the universe did not respond. The sky outside remained blue. The birds continued their song. Somewhere, a neighbor laughed. The indifference of the world struck her like a second blow. How could everything continue as if nothing had happened? Did the earth not feel her pain? Did the sun not see her loss? This is how suffering enters unnoticed. The teachings say, not with warning, but with sudden certainty. Soon, people gathered. Voices overlapped. Hands reached out. Words of comfort fell like rain on stone. "Be strong," someone said. "It is fate," said another. "Time will heal," promised a third. Their words passed through her as if she were already half gone. Strong? How does one remain strong when the very reason for strength has vanished? She held her child for the last time before the body was taken away. The weight was familiar, yet unbearably foreign. This was the same child she had carried for months, the same arm she had rocked through fevered nights. And yet, now, there was a terrible absence inside the form she loved. Something essential had departed, leaving behind only the shell of memory. As the door closed behind them, carrying her child away, silence filled the house. Not a peaceful silence, but a hollow one. The kind that echoes even when no sound is made. She collapsed to the floor. In Buddhist teachings, suffering is not an exception, it is a truth. Yet knowing this intellectually does nothing to soften its first arrival. In that moment, the mother did not see truth. She saw injustice. She saw cruelty. She saw a universe that had stolen something irreplaceable without explanation or apology. Why my child? Why me? What sin have I committed? The mind, desperate for order, searches for blame. If suffering has a cause, perhaps it can be undone. Perhaps it can be bargained with. She blamed herself first. The nights she had been too tired. The moments she had been impatient. The times she had chosen work over play. Each memory transformed into an accusation. Each regret sharpening the blade already lodged in her heart. Then she blamed the world. Doctors, gods, fate, even love itself. For what kind of love creates bonds only to tear them apart? As the day wore on, rituals replaced chaos. Candles were lit. Incense burned. Prayers were murmured. She watched these acts as if from underwater, their meaning distant and unreal. People spoke of impermanence, of the natural cycle of life and death. Their words sounded hollow, even cruel. Impermanence, she thought bitterly, was an idea for monks and philosophers, not for mothers who had just lost a child. Night fell quietly, indifferent to her grief. She lay alone, staring at the ceiling, replaying the morning again and again, as if repetition might reveal a hidden door to a different ending. But there was none. Each replay ended the same way. Silence where laughter once lived. This was her first direct encounter with dukkha, suffering not as a concept, but as a lived reality. Not the small disappointments of daily life, but the deep, existential wound that splits the heart open. In Buddhist wisdom, it is said that suffering arises from attachment, from clinging to what we believe should remain. Yet for her, attachment did not feel like a mistake. It felt like love itself, and love, she believed, should never be punished. Tears came in waves, sometimes violent, sometimes exhausted. At moments, she felt nothing at all, just a numb emptiness that frightened her more than pain. She pressed her hand against her chest, wondering how a heart could continue beating when everything it beat for was gone. Before sleep finally claimed her, a single thought surfaced, quiet but persistent. If this pain exists, there must be a reason. If life can break so completely, perhaps it is meant to teach something she does not yet understand. She did not know then that this question, born from unbearable loss, would one day open the door to compassion deeper than she had ever imagined. For now, there was only darkness, only grief, only a mother's tears falling into the vast, silent night. And yet, even in that silence, the first seed had been planted, the seed of awakening, waiting patiently beneath the weight of sorrow. The days that followed blurred into one long, colorless stretch of time. Morning and night lost their meaning. Meals went untouched. Sleep came in fragments, slipping away the moment she reached for it. The house, once alive with small sounds, footsteps, laughter, questions asked without pause, now echoed with absence. Every corner held a memory, and every memory cut like glass. People continued to come. They brought food she did not eat, flowers she did not smell, words she did not hear. They sat beside her, spoke softly, and watched her face with concern, as if expecting grief to follow a recognizable shape. But grief did not move in straight lines. It arrived suddenly, retreated without warning, and returned heavier each time. She learned quickly that pain, when it is deep enough, becomes invisible. From the outside, she appeared calm. She nodded when spoken to. She thanked those who offered condolences. She even managed to stand upright, to walk, to perform the necessary rituals of mourning. But inside, her world was fractured beyond repair. Thoughts collided and scattered. Emotions tangled until none could be named clearly. This was the weight of unspoken grief, the kind that words could not carry. At night, when the house was finally empty and the voices of others faded, her mind turned against her. It replayed moments she could no longer change. The last conversation, the last smile, the last time she had been distracted, tired, impatient. If only I had listened more closely. If only I had noticed something was wrong. If only I had held my child longer that morning. Each if only tightened around her chest like a rope. In Buddhist teachings, the mind is often compared to a wild animal, restless and difficult to tame. She understood this now, not as metaphor, but as experience. Her thoughts ran without direction, dragging her through guilt, fear, and longing. No matter how exhausted she felt, her mind refused to rest. Sometimes, anger surged unexpectedly. She resented the people who spoke gently, who tried to soothe her with explanations. She resented their intact families, their living children. She even resented her own body for continuing to breathe when her child no longer did. Most of all, she resented herself. There was a particular cruelty in the way the mind turned love into accusation. The very depth of her care became the measure of her perceived failure. She had loved deeply, so deeply that now she believed she must have failed just as deeply. No one spoke of this kind of guilt. It was not polite. It did not fit into the acceptable expressions of mourning. And so she carried it alone. During the day, she moved through the house slowly, as if walking through water. Her hands reached for familiar tasks out of habit, folding clothes, wiping surfaces, arranging objects that no longer needed order. Each task ended the same way. Her hands would stop mid-motion as she remembered who these acts were once for. The child's room remained untouched. At first, she could not enter it. The door stood closed, guarding a space that felt both sacred and unbearable. When she finally opened it days later, the smell of childhood still lingered. Soap, clean fabric, something sweet she could not name. It struck her with unexpected force. She sank to the floor, pressing her face into the blanket, breathing in what remained of a presence that no longer existed. This, too, was suffering, not dramatic, not visible, but profound. In Buddhist understanding, suffering is not limited to pain itself. It includes the longing for what is gone, the fear of what may come, and the resistance to what is. She lived all three at once. She longed for her child's return, feared a future without meaning, and resisted a reality she could not accept. Time, people said, would make it easier, but time felt like betrayal. Each passing hour carried her further from the last moment she had shared with her child. Forgetting, even unintentionally, felt like abandonment. So she clung to memory with desperate intensity. She repeated her child's name silently, as if saying it enough times might prevent it from fading. She replayed laughter in her mind, reconstructed small gestures, preserved every detail with fierce determination. The thought of losing even one fragment terrified her. Yet the clinging brought no comfort. It only sharpened the pain. One afternoon, as she sat alone by the window, she noticed a line of ants crossing the floor, carrying crumbs far larger than themselves. She watched them move with purpose, uninterrupted by her suffering. The world continued its quiet rhythms. Life fed on life. Movement followed movement. For a brief moment, anger flared again. How could the world remain so orderly when her life had collapsed into chaos? But beneath the anger, something else stirred, a faint awareness that the world had never promised fairness. It had never guaranteed permanence. She had assumed these things without realizing it. Her pain was not only from loss, but from the sudden collapse of the beliefs she had built her life upon. This realization did not bring peace. Not yet, but it planted a question. In the evenings, exhaustion finally overcame thought, and she slept lightly, haunted by dreams that dissolved upon waking. Each morning brought the same shock. The truth was still there. The loss had not been reversed. The silence remained. Grief, she discovered, did not diminish simply because the world expected it to. It did not follow schedules or social timelines. It had its own weight, its own pace. And so, she learned to carry it quietly. There were moments, brief and unexpected, when tears did not come. In those moments, she felt almost normal, and immediately guilt followed. How could she feel anything other than pain? Was this a betrayal of her love? Thus, even relief became another source of suffering. In Buddhism, this endless cycle, pain giving rise to thought, thought giving rise to more pain, is known as samsara, the wheel of suffering. She was caught within it, though she did not yet have words for what she was experiencing. All she knew was this. Her grief was no longer just an emotion. It had become a landscape she inhabited, vast and inescapable. And yet, beneath the heaviness, beneath the unspoken sorrow, something quietly endured. She continued to wake each morning. She continued to breathe. She continued to witness the world. This endurance was not strength. It was not courage. It was simply life persisting in the presence of unbearable weight. Unknowingly, she was learning her first lesson, not through study or belief, but through lived experience. That suffering does not disappear when ignored. that grief deepens when carried alone, and that the heart, even when broken, continues to feel. This understanding did not free her, but prepared the ground. For in the depths of unspoken grief, the heart begins, slowly, painfully, to soften. And in that softening, though she could not yet see it, the path toward compassion was quietly forming. Grief does not remain silent forever. When it can no longer be held inside, it seeks a voice, even if that voice breaks against emptiness. After the early days of numbness and quiet sorrow, something inside the mother shifted. The weight in her chest grew restless, pressing outward, demanding release. Tears alone were no longer enough. Silence began to feel like suffocation. She wanted answers. At first, her questions were whispered, as if the universe might overhear and respond gently. Why did this happen? Why so suddenly? Why my child? But no answer came. So her whispers grew louder. She spoke to the empty room, to the still air, to whatever unseen force might exist beyond her understanding. Sometimes she spoke to the memory of her child, asking forgiveness for failures she could no longer correct. Sometimes she spoke to life itself, accusing it of cruelty, of indifference, of theft. Her voice cracked with exhaustion, but she continued. If there is justice in this world, where is it now? If there is meaning, why does it hide? In Buddhist teachings, it is said that the mind seeks causes and conditions, believing that if the reason for suffering can be found, suffering itself can be undone. She felt this deeply. If she could locate the cause, one mistake, one moment, one missed sign, perhaps the pain would loosen its grip. She replayed the past relentlessly, dissecting it with merciless precision. Every memory became evidence in a trial where she stood both accused and judge. No verdict brought relief. Each conclusion only led to new questions. Sometimes her anger turned outward. She blamed the doctors who had not acted quickly enough, the systems that had failed her, the warnings that had not been given. Even the teachings she had once heard about impermanence now felt like hollow excuses. If everything is impermanent, she thought bitterly, then what is the point of love? At other times, her anger turned upward, toward heaven, toward the idea of gods, toward the notion that some higher order governed life. If such an order existed, she wanted nothing to do with it. She shouted once, alone in the house, her voice raw and unrestrained. "Take me instead." The words echoed briefly, then vanished into silence. The world did not answer. This silence enraged her more than any response could have. An answer, even a cruel one, would have acknowledged her pain. But the universe remained unmoved, continuing its rhythms without pause. In moments like these, suffering reveals its most piercing edge, not just pain, but isolation. The sense that one's agony exists in a vacuum, unseen and unheard. She began to notice how quickly people grew uncomfortable with her grief. Friends avoided her gaze. Conversations shortened. The world, it seemed, preferred her sorrow to be contained, manageable, and brief. "You must let go," someone advised gently. "You must be strong," another insisted. "Your child would not want you to suffer," a third added. Each sentence, meant as comfort, landed like a quiet dismissal. Let go of what? Be strong for whom? And how could she imagine what her child wanted when the child was no longer there to speak? She learned that grief, when it lasts too long, makes others uneasy. It disrupts their belief that life is predictable, that loss can be neatly resolved. And so, without intending harm, they distance themselves. Her cries grew quieter, not because the pain lessened, but because there was nowhere left to direct them. Inside her, something hardened, not permanently, but protectively. In Buddhist understanding, this is how aversion forms. When pain feels overwhelming, the heart tightens, building walls in an attempt to survive. She did not recognize this as a spiritual process. She only knew that openness felt dangerous, that vulnerability invited wounds she could no longer bear. And yet, even as she resisted the world, she continued to search for meaning. Late one night, unable to sleep, she sat on the floor and stared at a single candle burning on the table. The flame flickered slightly, responding to unseen currents of air. She watched as the wax melted, transformed, disappeared. Without intending to, she thought, "This flame will go out. This candle will end." The thought startled her, not because it was new, but because it was suddenly undeniable. Everything she had ever loved would one day vanish. Not just her child. Everyone. Everything. The mind recoiled from this truth, yet could not escape it. This realization did not bring comfort, but it brought clarity. For the first time, she saw that her suffering was not only about loss, it was about resistance. Resistance to a reality she had never wanted to see. Still, understanding did not ease her pain. She cried again, softer this time, not in rage, but in exhaustion. Her questions no longer demanded answers. They simply hung in the air, unanswered and heavy. And in that moment of surrender, not acceptance, but weariness, something subtle occurred. She noticed that beneath her grief was love. Raw, aching, undiminished love. The tears she shed were not only tears of pain. They were tears of connection to a bond that death had not erased. The realization confused her. If love still existed, where did it live now? This question lingered quietly, replacing her earlier accusations. In Buddhist thought, suffering often precedes insight, not because pain is noble, but because it strips away illusion. She was beginning, without knowing it, to see beyond her demands for control. She could not force answers. She could not reverse loss. She could not command the universe to explain itself. The world was not listening, not because it was cruel, but because it was not something to be negotiated with. As dawn approached, the candle finally burned low. The flame trembled, then disappeared, leaving behind a thin trail of smoke. She watched without turning away. For the first time since her loss, she did not scream. She did not accuse. She did not beg. She simply observed. This was not peace. Not yet. But it was the end of resistance. And in that quiet witnessing, as the candle's smoke dissolved into empty space, the first crack appeared in the wall she had built around her heart. Through that crack, though faint and fragile, understanding would one day enter. Not as an answer to her questions, but as a transformation of the one who asked them. Grief did not loosen its grip when the tears quieted. It simply changed its form. After the nights of crying out to an unlistening world, the mother entered a different terrain, one less dramatic, yet no less painful. The mind, exhausted from rage and pleading, turned inward. It began to cling. She noticed it first in small moments. A sound that resembled her child's footsteps made her heart race. A laugh from a neighbor's home tightened her chest. The scent of soap she once used for her child stopped her mid-step. Each sensation pulled her backward, away from the present, into a past that no longer existed. Her mind refused to release what it loved. In Buddhist teaching, attachment is often misunderstood as simple desire. But what she experienced was deeper. It was not wanting something new. It was refusing to accept the end of what had been. The mind, unable to change reality, tried to preserve it internally. She kept her child alive through memory. Every night, she replayed scenes with painstaking detail. The way small hands reached for her, the sound of a voice calling her name, the warmth of a body curled beside her during sleep. These recollections felt like the only proof that the love had been real, that it still mattered. Letting go felt like betrayal. If she released these images, who would remember? If she stopped replaying them, would her child disappear completely? The fear was subtle but relentless. And so she clung, not out of ignorance, but out of devotion. Yet the clinging carried a hidden cost. Each memory brought comfort for a moment, then sharpened into pain. The sweetness of the past contrasted cruelly with the emptiness of the present. The mind, trapped between longing and loss, found no rest. She noticed how often her thoughts began with if. If I had woken earlier. If I had taken a different path. If I had noticed sooner. The mind constructed endless alternate realities, worlds where her child still lived, where tragedy had been avoided by one small change. These imagined timelines felt vivid, almost reachable, and yet each one ended the same way, with a brutal return to what was. This was the mind's refusal to accept impermanence. In Buddhist wisdom, impermanence is not a punishment. It is the fundamental nature of existence. But to the grieving heart, impermanence feels like theft. Something precious is taken without consent, without warning, without explanation. She understood now that her suffering did not come only from loss, but from the struggle against what could not be changed. Still, understanding did not free her. One afternoon, she found herself holding one of her child's old toys. It was worn, faded from use. She traced its edges slowly, remembering the laughter it once brought. Her grip tightened, as if holding firmly enough could anchor the past to the present. A quiet thought arose, uninvited. This object will not bring the child back. She resisted the thought at first, pushing it away. But it returned, gentler this time. This object holds memory, not life. Her hands loosened slightly. For a brief moment, she saw how attachment worked. Not as love itself, but as fear disguised as love. Fear that without holding on, everything meaningful would vanish. The realization frightened her. If she let go of her child internally, who would she be? A mother without a child? A love without an object? The identity she had lived within had collapsed, and the mind, desperate for stability, clung to what remained. In Buddhist psychology, the sense of self is shaped by roles, relationships, and stories we tell ourselves. Her role had been clear, unquestioned, and central. Now it was gone, leaving behind a painful question. Who am I now? The mind offered no answer, only more memories to cling to. She began to notice the physical toll of this inner struggle. Her body was tense, shoulders lifted even in rest. Her breath remained shallow, as if the chest feared opening too fully. Sleep, when it came, was heavy and unrefreshing. Clinging was exhausting, and yet, releasing felt impossible. There were moments when she sensed a different path, brief, fleeting moments when she allowed the pain to be present without chasing memory or explanation. In those moments, something softened. The ache remained, but it was quieter, less sharp. But the mind quickly intervened. Don't relax, it whispered. If you stop holding on, you will lose everything. And so the cycle continued. She saw now how suffering multiplied itself. Loss gave rise to longing. Longing gave rise to clinging. Clinging gave rise to exhaustion. Exhaustion fed despair. This was not punishment. It was mechanics. The Buddha had taught that suffering arises not from pain alone, but from attachment to pleasure and aversion to pain. She lived this truth directly, though she had never studied it. Her pain was real and unavoidable. But the additional suffering, the relentless mental struggle, came from the refusal to allow reality to be as it was. Still, knowing this did not mean she could simply stop. One evening, as she sat quietly, watching shadows move across the wall, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. Not a dramatic one, just a small, ordinary moment. Her child had once fallen asleep against her chest, breath slow and warm. She remembered thinking then, without knowing why, this moment will not last. At the time, the thought had been bittersweet. Now it returned with a different weight. The moment had ended, just as it always had to. She felt a sharp pain, and then beneath it, something else. Gratitude, not relief, not happiness, but a quiet acknowledgement that the love had existed at all. The mind resisted immediately, warning her not to soften, not to accept. But the seed had been planted. She had glimpsed a different relationship to memory, not as something to cling to, but as something to honor without possession. In Buddhism, this shift is subtle but profound. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It means releasing the demand that things remain as they were. She was not ready yet, not fully, but she had begun to see that the mind's refusal to let go was not protecting her. It was prolonging her suffering. That night, as she lay awake, she placed her hand on her chest and noticed her breath, shallow at first, then slightly deeper. She did not force it. She simply observed. For the first time, she allowed a thought to arise without following it. Just one. The pain remained, but she was not entirely consumed by it. This small act, this moment of awareness, was fragile, easily lost, but it marked the beginning of a new relationship with her grief. Not as something to escape, not as something to cling to, but as something to be seen. The mind still resisted. It would resist many times again. But now, within that resistance, awareness had appeared. And awareness, though quiet, would prove stronger than clinging. This was the beginning, not of healing, but of seeing. And seeing, in the Buddhist path, is where freedom begins. There came a day when the mother realized she could no longer outrun her pain. It was not a dramatic decision, nor a moment of clarity that arrived like lightning. It was simply exhaustion, the deep, bone-heavy fatigue that follows long resistance. The mind had spent weeks clinging, replaying, arguing, imagining other endings. The body had followed, tense and vigilant, as if danger still hovered nearby. Together, they had fought a battle that could not be won. That morning, she woke before dawn, not startled by grief as she had been so many times before, but heavy with it. The familiar ache pressed against her chest, steady and unrelenting. She lay still, eyes open, listening to the quiet house. For the first time, she did not reach for memory. She did not ask questions. She did not try to escape. She simply noticed the pain. It felt like a weight, dense, dark, and immovable, resting where her heart had once felt light. It was not sharp. It was not dramatic. It was a constant presence, like a stone placed inside her. Normally, she would have tightened around it, tensing her body, holding her breath, bracing herself. This time, she did something different. She breathed. The breath was shallow at first, cautious, as though afraid of touching the pain too closely. But slowly, gently, it deepened. As her chest rose and fell, she felt the ache respond, not easing, not intensifying, but revealing itself more clearly. This is what it feels like, she thought. This is suffering. In Buddhist teaching, suffering is not something to be feared or avoided. It is something to be understood. But understanding does not come from analysis. It comes from direct contact. She was making contact now. As she sat up in bed, the pain followed her, neither better nor worse. It simply was. And in that simple fact, something inside her shifted. She saw, perhaps for the first time, that pain did not increase when she stopped fighting it. It did not swallow her whole. It remained present, but it did not destroy her. This surprised her. She carried this awareness with her as the morning unfolded. When she walked into the kitchen, the familiar emptiness greeted her, the absence of small movements, the silence where a voice once asked questions. The ache returned strongly, tightening her throat. Normally, she would have turned away. Instead, she paused. She placed one hand on the counter, the other on her chest, and stayed. Tears came, slow and steady. She did not wipe them away. She did not scold herself for weakness. She let them fall, feeling their warmth on her skin. This was not surrender in the sense of giving up. It was surrender in the sense of stopping the fight. She realized how much energy she had spent trying not to feel what was already there. The struggle itself had been exhausting. And now, by allowing the pain to exist without resistance, she felt, if not relief, then space. Suffering, when faced directly, was no longer an enemy. It was an experience. Throughout the day, she practiced this quiet turning toward pain. When a memory arose, she noticed it without chasing it. When longing surged, she acknowledged it without feeding it. When guilt appeared, she observed its texture, its weight, its familiar patterns. I'm feeling guilt, she noted. I'm feeling longing. I'm feeling sadness. Naming the experience created a small distance. Not a cold distance, but a compassionate one. The emotions remained intense, but they were no longer fused with her entire identity. She was not only grief. She was someone experiencing grief. This distinction mattered more than she could have imagined. In Buddhist insight, this is the beginning of mindfulness, the simple, non-judgmental awareness of what is present. It does not erase pain. It changes the relationship to pain. As evening approached, she sat by the window again, watching the light fade from the sky. The familiar ache was there, steady and deep. But now, alongside it was curiosity. What happens if I stay with this feeling? What does it want to show me? She noticed that beneath the pain was fear, not fear of death, but fear of aloneness. Fear that without her child, her life had lost its center. Fear that the love she had carried had nowhere to go. This fear softened as she looked at it directly. Then she noticed something else. Beneath the fear was tenderness. The pain did not feel empty. It felt full of love that had not disappeared, only lost its form. The ache in her chest was not proof of absence alone. It was proof of connection. This realization did not remove the sorrow, but it transformed it. Suffering, she began to see, was not just something happening to her. It was something revealing the depth of her heart. She thought of all the times she had avoided pain in her life. Small pains, manageable pains. How quickly she had turned away from discomfort, seeking distraction, control, or reassurance. Now, she was learning a different way. To stay, to feel, to listen. As night fell, she lit a candle and sat quietly on the floor. The flame burned steadily, casting soft shadows on the walls. She watched it without expectation. The ache remained, but it did not demand action. Her breathing slowed. Thoughts arose and passed. Some were painful, some were gentle. She did not cling to any of them. For the first time since her loss, she felt present. Not happy, not calm, but present. Fully here with what was. This presence did not feel like healing. It felt like honesty. In Buddhist practice, it is said that when we stop turning away from suffering, it becomes our teacher. She did not yet know what her suffering would teach her, but she sensed that something important was unfolding. The pain had not diminished, but her fear of the pain had. And in that subtle shift, from resistance to willingness, she discovered a quiet strength she had not known she possessed. Not the strength of endurance, not the strength of control, but the strength of openness. That night, as she lay down to sleep, the ache was still there. It accompanied her into rest, like a shadow that no longer frightened her. She placed her hand on her chest once more and breathed. I can be with this, she thought. I'm still here. Meeting suffering face to face did not end her grief, but it ended her war with it. And in that ending, something new began. A path not away from pain, but through it. Suffering, once met directly, began to speak in a different voice. It did not shout. It did not accuse. It whispered. In the days that followed her quiet turning toward pain, the mother noticed subtle changes. Not in the intensity of her grief, but in the way it moved. The ache no longer surged without warning like a storm. It flowed more like a tide, rising and falling, sometimes gentle, sometimes heavy, but always changing. Change. The word entered her awareness softly, almost reluctantly. She had spent so long resisting change, wishing time would stop, wishing the past would hold, wishing the moment of loss could be undone, that she had not noticed how everything around her continued to shift, moment by moment. One afternoon, she stepped outside for the first time in days. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth. Leaves stirred slightly in the breeze, some clinging to branches, others already fallen and scattered across the ground. She watched a single leaf detach, drifting slowly downward until it touched the soil. Something in her chest tightened. The leaf did not fall because it was broken. It fell because it was time. This simple observation unsettled her more than she expected. In Buddhist understanding, impermanence is not a concept to be debated. It is a truth to be observed. Everything that arises will pass away, not as punishment, not as injustice, but as nature itself. She had heard this before in passing, but now, standing among fallen leaves, the truth felt personal. Her child's life had arisen. Her child's life had passed away. The mind recoiled instinctively, wanting to argue, wanting to reject the comparison. A child was not a leaf. A life was not something that should simply end. And yet, beneath the resistance, a deeper recognition stirred. Nothing she had ever loved had been guaranteed. Not her child, not her own life, not even this moment. The realization did not bring peace. It brought sorrow, deep, aching sorrow. But it was a different sorrow than before. Less frantic, less desperate, more honest. She walked slowly, noticing details she had once overlooked. Cracks in the pavement where small plants pushed through. The sound of distant footsteps approaching, then fading. The way shadows shifted as the sun moved across the sky. Everything was in motion, even her grief. She stopped and placed a hand over her heart, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. Each beat arrived, lingered briefly, then vanished, replaced by the next. Even this, so essential, so central, was impermanent moment by moment. She thought of the candle she had watched burn down days earlier. The flame had not been stolen. It had completed its nature. The thought was uncomfortable. It challenged the belief that life owed her permanence in exchange for love. Did love require ownership? Did care demand control? These questions did not seek immediate answers. They simply rested within her, heavy but alive. That night, as she lay awake, the whisper of impermanence returned, not as a threat, but as an invitation. Look closely, it seemed to say. See how things truly are. She noticed how sensations arose and passed within her own body. The ache in her chest intensified, softened, then shifted location slightly. Thoughts appeared, images, words, regrets, then dissolved when she did not pursue them. Even pain was not fixed. This surprised her. She had believed her grief was solid, immovable, permanent. But now, by observing it rather than fighting it, she saw its fluid nature. It changed shape. It changed intensity. It changed meaning. Impermanence did not mean absence. It meant movement. In Buddhist teaching, clinging arises when we mistake what is transient for what is lasting. She saw now how deeply she had clung, not only to her child, but to the idea that love could freeze life in place. The truth was harder. Love did not stop change. Love flowed through it. She felt resistance again, sharp and immediate. The mind protested. If everything changes, then what can be trusted? What is safe? What is worth loving? The fear beneath these questions was profound. Impermanence threatened the illusion of security she had lived within all her life. But another realization followed quietly behind the fear. If everything is impermanent, then pain, too, will change. Not disappear suddenly, not vanish by force, but shift, soften, transform. This did not minimize her loss. It did not suggest that grief had an expiration date. It simply acknowledged that nothing, not even suffering, was frozen in time. She remembered moments of her life before becoming a mother, how those years had passed without her noticing their ending. She remembered the early days of her child's life, how quickly they had moved, how she had once wished time would slow. Tom had not listened then, either. And yet, those moments had existed fully while they lasted. This thought brought an unexpected wave of tenderness. Her child's life had not been incomplete. It had been whole, just brief. The mind resisted again, grasping for comparison, fairness, explanation. But she stayed with the feeling instead of the argument. The pain in her chest softened slightly. Not because the loss mattered less, but because it was no longer being measured against an imagined permanence that had never existed. Impermanence, she began to understand, was not the enemy of meaning. It was the condition that made meaning possible. A moment mattered because it did not last. A life mattered because it was finite. Without knowing it, she was touching wisdom, not as an abstract idea, but as lived insight. She did not feel calm. She did not feel resolved. She felt humbled. As days passed, she noticed that her relationship to memory was changing. She still remembered her child often, but the memories no longer always pulled her backward. Sometimes they arrived gently, like visitors rather than captors. She could smile briefly without guilt. She could cry without collapsing. Impermanence had begun to loosen the grip of clinging. This did not mean letting go of love. It meant releasing the demand that love protect her from change. One evening, she sat outside again, watching the sky darken. Clouds drifted slowly, reshaping themselves continuously. No single form remained long enough to be grasped. She breathed in, then out. I cannot hold the sky, she thought. Yet I can see it. The same was true of her life, of her child, of her grief. Seeing did not require possession. As night fell, the whisper of impermanence no longer felt cruel. It felt honest. And in honesty, there was relief. Not the relief of escape, but the relief of no longer fighting reality. She understood now that suffering had been intensified by her refusal to accept change. Not because she was weak, but because she was human. Acceptance did not erase love. It freed it. That night, as she lay down to sleep, the ache returned, as it always did. But alongside it was something new. Trust. Not trust that things would be easy. Not trust that pain would disappear. But trust that she could meet whatever arose. Because everything that arose would also pass. Impermanence was no longer just a truth she feared. It had become a quiet companion, guiding her gently toward the next unfolding of her journey. The encounter did not arrive with ceremony. There was no announcement, no sign that marked the moment as important. Like most turning points in life, it appeared quietly, almost unnoticed, woven into the fabric of an ordinary day. The mother had begun taking short walks again, not out of purpose, but out of necessity. The walls of her home felt heavy now, saturated with memory. Walking allowed her breath to move, her thoughts to loosen their grip just enough to be bearable. That morning, the air was cool and still. She followed a familiar path without intention, her feet carrying her forward while her mind hovered somewhere between past and present. She did not plan to go anywhere meaningful. She simply walked. At the edge of the path stood a small temple she had passed many times before. She had never entered it. Before her loss, she had always been too busy, too distracted, too certain of her own direction. Spiritual places had seemed distant, optional, spaces for those seeking answers she did not yet know she lacked. Today, something slowed her steps. The temple was modest, its walls weathered by time. Incense smoke drifted gently from the open doorway, curling upward as if dissolving into the sky. The sound of a bell echoed faintly, then faded. She stood there for a long moment, unsure why she had stopped. Finally, she stepped inside. The space was quiet, not empty, but alive with stillness. Light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes suspended in the air. A few people sat scattered across the floor, unmoving, their posture calm and steady. At the front of the hall sat an elderly monk. He did not look up immediately. His presence was unremarkable. Simple robes, calm breathing, eyes half closed in meditation. There was no aura of authority, no dramatic intensity. And yet, something about his stillness drew her attention. She took a seat near the back, uncertain and self-conscious. Her body felt out of place among the quiet figures. Her mind raced, filled with the familiar ache. She did not come seeking wisdom. She came seeking relief. After a long silence, the monk spoke, not loudly, not urgently. Pain, he said, is something we all meet. But suffering is something we learn. The words startled her. She felt as if they had been spoken directly to her, though the monk's gaze remained unfocused, resting nowhere in particular. He continued gently. When we lose something precious, pain is natural. It is unavoidable. But suffering grows when the mind refuses to accept what has changed. Her chest tightened. She wanted to reject the words. They sounded too simple, too detached from the raw reality of loss. And yet, they echoed something she had already begun to sense within herself. The monk spoke of the Four Noble Truths, not as doctrine, but as lived experience. He spoke of suffering as a condition of existence, not as a personal failure. He spoke of craving, not only for pleasure, but for permanence, certainty, and control. He spoke of release, not as forgetting or indifference, but as understanding. She listened without moving. When the talk ended, people bowed quietly and began to leave. She remained seated, unsure what to do. Part of her wanted to leave quickly, to escape the vulnerability that had opened inside her. Another part felt rooted to the floor. The monk noticed her then. He approached slowly, his steps unhurried. "You look tired," he said simply. The words undid her. She did not cry immediately. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. When the tears came, they surprised her with their intensity. They flowed without restraint, carrying weeks of unspoken grief with them. "I lost my child," she finally managed to say. The monk did not flinch. He did not offer comfort in the way she had grown used to. No reassurances, no explanations, no promises of healing. He nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "That is very heavy." The simplicity of the acknowledgement brought another wave of tears. "I don't know how to live with this," she whispered. "Everyone tells me to let go. But how do you let go of your own heart?" The monk sat down beside her, his movements slow and grounded. "Letting go," he said, "is often misunderstood. It does not mean releasing love. It means releasing the belief that love must control what it touches." She stared at him, unsure whether to feel comforted or unsettled. "I don't want to forget," she said. "If I let go, it feels like I'm abandoning my child." The monk listened without interruption. "Love does not disappear when its form changes," he replied. "But clinging to form can turn love into suffering." His words landed gently, but their meaning was deep. He told her a story then, not as teaching, but as offering. A woman once came to the Buddha, carrying her dead child, begging for medicine to bring him back. The Buddha did not dismiss her. Instead, he asked her to bring him a mustard seed from a household untouched by death. She searched and searched, but found none. Through this search, she realized that loss was universal, that her pain, while deeply personal, was not isolated. As the monk spoke, something shifted within her. She had felt alone in her suffering, uniquely cursed, uniquely broken. Now, she glimpsed a different perspective, not one that diminished her pain, but one that placed it within the shared human condition. "You are not being punished," the monk said, as if sensing her thoughts. "You are meeting the same truth every being meets, sooner or later. Impermanence, loss, change." She felt resistance again, sharp and immediate. "But why does it hurt so much?" she asked. "If this is natural, why does it feel unbearable?" "Because love is deep," the monk replied. "And the deeper the love, the deeper the pain when form changes." He paused. "Pain shows us the size of our heart." This idea settled slowly. The monk did not offer techniques. He did not instruct her to meditate longer or think differently. He simply encouraged her to keep observing, to continue meeting her experience directly, without judgment or avoidance. "Suffering is not something to solve," he said. "It is something to understand." As she left the temple, the world looked subtly different. Not brighter, not easier, but clearer. The ache in her chest remained. The absence followed her home. But alongside it now was something else, a sense that her pain was not meaningless, that it was pointing towards something deeper than despair. She had not found answers. She had found a path that did not promise relief, but offered understanding. And for the first time since her loss, understanding felt like hope. Not hope that her child would return, not hope that pain would vanish, but hope that within suffering itself, there was wisdom waiting to be uncovered. The Dharma had not erased her grief. It had given it direction. And with that direction, her journey entered a new phase, one not defined by resistance or clinging, but by learning how to walk through loss, with open eyes and an open heart. After her visit to the temple, something subtle but irreversible had shifted within the mother. The grief was still there, deep, aching, and ever-present, but it no longer felt entirely private. It no longer felt like a punishment handed to her alone. The monk's words echoed quietly in her mind as she moved through the days that followed. You are meeting the same truth every being meets, sooner or later. At first, she resisted this idea. Her pain felt too intimate, too specific, too raw to be shared by others. No one else had lost her child. No one else carried this exact weight in their chest. And yet, the thought lingered, returning gently whenever she paused long enough to listen. She began to notice people more closely. Before her loss, she had seen others only in passing, faces in crowds, voices without stories. Now her eyes lingered. A woman standing alone at a bus stop, staring into the distance. An elderly man moving slowly, his posture curved as if shaped by years of quiet burden. A child clinging tightly to a parent's hand, unaware of how fragile that handhold truly was. Each face seemed to carry something unseen. One afternoon, while sitting in a small cafe, she watched a woman across the room wipe her eyes quickly, as if embarrassed by tears that had escaped without permission. No one else seemed to notice. The woman straightened her posture, forced a smile, and continued her conversation as though nothing had happened. The mother felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She understood that gesture now, the urgency to hide pain, the instinct to protect others from discomfort. She had done it herself so many times. In that moment, something softened. She did not know the woman's story. She did not need to. The tears were enough. Suffering, she began to realize, did not always announce itself. It did not always cry out or demand attention. Often, it lived quietly behind practiced expressions and routine movements. This recognition unsettled her at first. It stripped away the illusion that pain was rare, exceptional, or reserved for tragic circumstances alone. Loss took many forms: death, separation, regret, illness, disappointment, unfulfilled longing. Every human life, she now saw, was marked by it. The realization did not lessen her grief, but it changed its texture. Her suffering was no longer isolated. It was part of something vast. She returned to the temple a few days later, sitting quietly among others who had also come seeking stillness. As she looked around the room, she noticed the subtle signs: tired eyes, tense shoulders, hands folded tightly in laps. These were not people untouched by life. These were people learning how to carry it. She wondered what each person had lost: a parent, a partner, a dream, a sense of meaning. For the first time, she did not feel separate from them. She felt among them. In Buddhist understanding, this recognition is the doorway to compassion. Not the sentimental kind, but the deep, steady awareness that suffering is a shared condition. It does not erase individual pain. It connects it. As this awareness grew, her anger toward the world began to soften. Not disappear, but lose its sharp edge. The universe no longer felt like a personal adversary. It felt indifferent, yes, but impartially so. It took from everyone, eventually without discrimination. This truth was difficult, but strangely relieving. If suffering was universal, then she was not being singled out. If loss was inevitable, then her pain was not proof of failure. She began to see how her earlier isolation had intensified her grief. By believing her suffering was unique and incomprehensible, she had cut herself off from the very thing that could hold her: shared humanity. One evening, while walking home, she passed a small funeral procession. It moved slowly, quietly, accompanied by the low murmur of voices and the scent of incense. She stopped and watched from a distance, her heart heavy but steady. Once, such a sight would have shattered her. Now it opened her. She felt sorrow for the family. Genuine, unguarded sorrow. Not because it reminded her of her own loss, but because she recognized theirs. This was new. Her grief was no longer only about herself. At home that night, she sat quietly and reflected on this change. The pain in her chest was still present, but it felt less like a closed wound and more like an opening, tender, vulnerable, but alive. She thought of the story the monk had shared, the woman searching for a household untouched by death. At first, the story had felt cruel. Now it felt honest. There was no household untouched by loss. There was no life exempt from change. This understanding did not make her loss easier to bear, but it made it meaningful in a new way. Her pain connected her to every being who had ever loved and lost. This connection gave rise to something unfamiliar. When she saw others struggle, she no longer looked away. She no longer felt impatient with their pain or uncomfortable in its presence. She recognized it. She began to listen more carefully, to offer silence instead of advice, to sit with others without trying to fix them. She discovered that compassion did not require solutions. It required presence. This presence transformed her own suffering as well. When she stopped resisting the pain of others, she also stopped resisting her own quite so fiercely. The boundaries between my pain and your pain softened. She was still a mother who had lost her child, but she was also a human being among human beings. This dual awareness grounded her. In Buddhist teaching, wisdom and compassion are inseparable. Wisdom sees the truth of suffering. Compassion responds to it. She was beginning to experience this directly, not as a principle, but as a lived reality. One night, as she prepared to sleep, she felt the familiar ache return strongly. For a moment, the loneliness threatened to pull her under again. Then she thought of all the others lying awake at that same hour, burdened by their own forms of loss. The thought did not erase her pain, but it held it. She was no longer alone in the night. Her tears came again, but they felt different, less desperate, less isolated. They flowed as an expression of connection rather than abandonment. In seeing that suffering was universal, she had not diminished her grief. She had widened her heart, and in that widening, compassion began to arise, not as an effort, not as a duty, but as a natural response to shared vulnerability. This compassion did not yet feel like strength. It felt fragile, tentative, but it was real, and it marked a profound turning point. For the first time since her loss, her pain was no longer closing her off from the world. It was opening her to it. Grief had once felt like a wall, thick, impenetrable, and isolating. Now, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to feel like a door. The mother did not wake one morning suddenly transformed. There was no moment when sorrow vanished or clarity arrived fully formed. Instead, something gentler happened. Her heart, long clenched in defense, began to loosen its grip. This softening did not come from effort. It came from understanding. By recognizing that suffering was shared, that pain moved through every life without discrimination, she no longer felt singled out by fate. Her grief was still deeply personal, but it was no longer wrapped in bitterness or resentment toward the world. The sharp edges of anger began to dull. She noticed this change in small, unexpected ways. One afternoon, while walking through the market, she saw a child stumble and fall. The child cried out, startled more than hurt. Instinctively, the mother stepped forward, her body responding before her mind could intervene. She knelt, offering comfort with a soft voice and a steady presence, until the child's parent arrived. As she stood up, her heart raced, not with pain, but with recognition. Once, the sight of a child would have pierced her like a blade. It still stirred deep emotion, but now, alongside the ache, there was warmth, concern, care. She was surprised by herself. Love had not disappeared with her loss. It had changed its direction. This realization stayed with her long after she left the market. She thought about how fiercely she had tried to protect her heart from further pain by closing it off. Yet here she was, opening again, not because the world had become safe, but because she had learned that closing the heart only multiplied suffering. In Buddhist teaching, compassion arises naturally when the illusion of separateness dissolves. She was beginning to experience this truth firsthand. The boundary between my suffering and others' suffering had thinned. She noticed how differently she listened now. When people spoke of their difficulties, she no longer felt impatient or helpless. She did not rush to offer solutions or reassuring words. She simply stayed. And in staying, something remarkable happened. People began to open up. A neighbor spoke quietly about a failing marriage. A colleague admitted to long-standing fear and loneliness. An acquaintance confessed grief over a parent lost years earlier, pain that had never fully healed. The mother did not feel overwhelmed by these stories. She felt present. Her own grief had trained her to sit with discomfort without turning away. It had stripped her of the need to fix or explain. She knew now that presence itself was a form of kindness. This presence also changed the way she related to her own pain. When waves of sorrow rose unexpectedly, she no longer resisted them with panic. She met them with the same patience she offered others. She allowed herself to cry without shame, to feel heaviness without judgment. She began speaking to herself differently. "This is hard," she would think gently, "and it makes sense that it hurts." This inner kindness was new. Before, her internal voice had been harsh, critical, demanding strength at all costs. Now it softened, mirroring the compassion she extended outward. In Buddhist practice, this is known as loving kindness, not as a technique, but as a quality of heart that grows through understanding. It does not deny pain. It holds it. One evening, while sitting quietly at home, she placed her hand over her heart as she had learned to do when the ache intensified. She noticed the familiar heaviness, but also something else, a warmth beneath it. The warmth surprised her. It felt like love, still alive, still flowing. She realized then that grief had never been the opposite of love. It was love shaped by loss. This insight dissolved a long-held fear. She had believed that if the pain eased, it would mean her love was fading. Now she saw that love did not depend on suffering to prove its depth. Love did not need pain to exist. Pain was simply love encountering change. This understanding softened her further. She began to forgive herself for moments of relief, for brief smiles, for laughter that escaped without permission. Joy no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like life continuing to express itself through her. She was still a mother. Her love had not ended. It had expanded. As weeks passed, her presence began to influence the spaces she entered. People felt calmer around her, though they could not explain why. There was a steadiness in her now, a groundedness that came not from certainty, but from acceptance. She did not speak often about her loss. When she did, her words were simple and honest, free from the need to dramatize or defend. She spoke of her child with tenderness, not desperation. She noticed how this affected others. Instead of pulling away in discomfort, people listened. Some cried with her. Some shared their own losses. The shared vulnerability created connection rather than distance. In Buddhist wisdom, compassion is not something we give from abundance. It is something that flows from having touched our own suffering deeply. She had touched it fully, and it had changed her. This change did not mean her grief had ended. There were still nights when loneliness pressed heavily, when memories arrived uninvited, when the ache returned with full force. But now, when it did, her heart did not harden. She could hold pain and love at the same time. One night, as she lay awake, she remembered her child's laughter, clear and bright. The memory brought tears, but also a smile. She let both exist together. For the first time, she did not feel torn apart by the contrast. This was the softening, not the weakening of the heart, but its opening. Her suffering had not made her smaller. It had made her more human. And in becoming more human, she was discovering the quiet power of compassion, a power born not from effort or intention, but from having allowed pain to shape her without destroying her. The heart that once felt broken beyond repair was learning a new rhythm, a rhythm that could hold grief without collapsing, that could meet the world without fear, and that could love without demanding permanence. This softening marked the true turning point of her journey. For from here, compassion would no longer be something she tried to practice. It would be something she lived. There was a time when the mother believed pain demanded resistance, that suffering had to be endured, conquered, or silenced. Now, slowly, she was learning something radically different. Pain did not need to be pushed away. It needed to be held. This understanding did not arrive as an idea, but as a practice, quiet, repetitive, and often imperfect. Each day offered countless opportunities to meet pain again, and each time, she chose to meet it with a gentler hand. The ache in her chest still appeared without warning. Some mornings it greeted her the moment she opened her eyes, heavy and insistent. Other days it waited, rising quietly in the afternoon or settling into her bones as night fell. Before, she had braced herself against it. Now she softened. She began to notice the way her body reacted to pain. The tightening of her jaw, the lifting of her shoulders, the shallow breath that tried to protect her from feeling too much. These reactions were not failures. They were habits learned over a lifetime of avoiding discomfort. Instead of judging them, she acknowledged them. "Of course you tighten," she thought gently. "You have been trying to survive." This inner dialogue marked a profound shift. She was no longer at war with herself. She was becoming an ally. In Buddhist practice, kindness toward one's own suffering is not indulgence. It is clarity. Without kindness, awareness becomes harsh and incomplete. She was learning this through experience, one breath at a time. When the pain rose, she placed her hand over her heart, feeling the warmth of her palm against her chest. She breathed slowly, not to calm herself, but to stay present. "This hurts," she admitted, "and I am here with it." Sometimes tears followed. Sometimes they did not. She no longer measured progress by how little she cried or how strong she appeared. Strength, she was discovering, was not the absence of pain. It was the willingness to remain open within it. She practiced this kindness everywhere. In the kitchen, when she reached for a cup her child once used. On the street, when a child's laughter caught her by surprise. In conversations, when well-meaning words reopened old wounds. Each time she paused, she felt the pain arise, and instead of pushing it down, she allowed it space. This allowance did not make the pain larger. It made it clearer. She noticed that pain, when met with kindness, did not demand drama. It did not need to overwhelm. It wanted to be acknowledged, not fought. There were days when she forgot. Days when the old patterns returned, when irritation flared, when exhaustion made her impatient with herself, when grief felt heavy and unmanageable again. On those days, she practiced kindness again, not toward the pain alone, but toward the forgetting itself. "You are learning," she reminded herself, and learning is not linear. This gentleness extended to her memories. Before, she had treated memory like a fragile object that had to be protected at all costs. Now, she allowed memories to come and go naturally. When a joyful memory arose, she let herself feel the warmth without clinging. When a painful one appeared, she met it with compassion rather than blame. She no longer interrogated the past. She no longer asked what she could have done differently. The questions that once tore her apart began to lose their urgency. Not because they were answered, but because she no longer needed them. She realized that self-blame had been another attempt at control. If the pain could be traced to a mistake, then perhaps it could be undone. Letting go of blame meant letting go of this illusion. This, too, required kindness. One evening, while sitting quietly, she noticed a familiar wave of guilt rising. Instead of following it, she turned toward it with curiosity. "What are you protecting?" she asked silently. The answer came not in words, but in feeling. The guilt was guarding love. It was the mind's attempt to prove devotion, to show that her love had been complete and total. Understanding this, she softened. "I love deeply," she acknowledged. "That is why this hurts." The guilt loosened its grip. In Buddhist wisdom, loving kindness begins with oneself because without it, compassion becomes imbalanced. She was learning that caring for her own heart did not diminish her love for her child. It honored it. As kindness took root within her, she noticed its effects spreading outward naturally. She spoke more gently. She listened more fully. She judged less quickly. When others expressed pain, she did not feel the need to distance herself. Their suffering did not threaten her own stability. She could sit with them just as she sat with herself. This was not because she had mastered her grief. It was because she had befriended it. One afternoon, she found herself sitting beside a woman who had recently lost her partner. The woman spoke haltingly, afraid of burdening someone else with her sorrow. The mother said only one thing: "You don't have to be strong here." The words surprised her as much as they comforted the other woman. They came from a place she had only recently discovered, a place of permission. Permission to hurt, permission to rest, permission to be human. As she walked home later, the ache returned briefly, as it often did after being present with another's pain. But this time, it did not feel like a setback. It felt like resonance. Compassion, she realized, was not something she gave away. It was something that circulated. Her kindness toward herself made kindness toward others possible, and her kindness toward others reflected back, deepening her own capacity to hold pain. That night, as she prepared to sleep, she noticed a quiet steadiness within her. The loss had not changed. The absence was still there, but her relationship to it had transformed. Pain was no longer an enemy. It was a messenger. It reminded her of love. It guided her toward presence. It invited kindness. She lay down, one hand resting over her heart, and breathed. "I can hold this," she thought, "and I do not have to hold it alone." Learning to hold pain with kindness did not erase suffering, but it dissolved the cruelty she had unknowingly added to it. And in the absence of cruelty, something profound emerged, a heart capable of tenderness, even in the midst of loss. This tenderness was not weakness. It was wisdom in its earliest form, and it would carry her forward, not away from pain, but through it, with compassion as her guide. Compassion did not arrive as a decision. It unfolded as a consequence. The mother did not wake one day resolved to care for others. She did not announce a mission or adopt a new identity shaped by virtue. What happened was quieter, slower, and far more honest. As she learned to hold her own pain with kindness, the boundaries that once separated her from the suffering of others began to dissolve. Her grief had softened her, not into fragility, but into receptivity. She noticed it first in the way she moved through the world. Where she once hurried, she now paused. Where she once turned away from discomfort, she leaned closer. Faces she might have overlooked before now held her attention. Stories she once would have avoided now invited her presence. Pain no longer frightened her. She recognized it. At a community gathering, a woman spoke hesitantly about her anxiety. Something invisible, something often dismissed. The mother listened, feeling the familiar tightening in her own chest as the woman described sleepless nights and relentless worry. She did not interrupt. She did not reassure. She simply stayed with the discomfort of hearing another's pain. Later, the woman thanked her. "You didn't try to fix me," she said. "You made me feel less alone." The words lingered. Less alone. The mother realized that this had been her deepest wound. Not just the loss itself, but the sense of isolation it created. And now, without planning to, she was helping to ease that same wound in others. She did not need to share her story to do this. Often, she said nothing at all. Her presence carried something different now, an unspoken permission for pain to exist. In Buddhist understanding, compassion arises when we see ourselves in others and others in ourselves. The illusion of separateness thins. She felt this happening in real time, not as a belief, but as a felt reality. When she saw someone struggling, her heart responded before her thoughts did. The response was not pity. It was recognition. "I know this terrain," her heart seemed to say. "I have walked here too." One afternoon, she volunteered at a small support group for those experiencing loss. She did not go as a guide or teacher. She went as a listener. As people spoke of children lost, partners gone, lives rearranged by illness or accident, she felt waves of emotion rise and fall within her. Some stories mirrored her own. Others differed completely. Yet beneath the details, the same currents flowed. Longing, fear, love, confusion. She saw how suffering wore many masks. Some cried openly. Some spoke calmly, as if reciting facts. Some avoided the deepest truths until the very end. She recognized all of these strategies. She had used them herself. When her turn came to speak, she hesitated. She did not want to center herself or reopen wounds unnecessarily. But something urged her forward, not to share pain, but to share understanding. "I don't have answers," she said quietly, "but I've learned that pain doesn't mean we are broken. It means we loved." The room fell silent, not from discomfort, but from resonance. In that silence, compassion moved freely. She noticed how her own grief behaved differently in these moments. Instead of overwhelming her, it felt purposeful. It connected rather than isolated. It expanded rather than contracted. This surprised her. She had once feared that opening her heart to others' suffering would drown her in pain. Instead, it steadied her. It placed her experience within a larger human story, one that did not erase individual loss, but gave it context. Her grief was no longer a private burden. It was a bridge. As weeks turned into months, she found herself drawn to simple acts of care. Sitting with someone who felt forgotten, bringing food to a family in crisis, writing a note to someone who had shared their pain with her. These acts were not heroic. They were ordinary, and yet they carried weight. In Buddhist teaching, compassion is not measured by scale. It is measured by sincerity. A single moment of genuine presence can relieve suffering more than grand gestures performed at a distance. She understood this now. She also noticed something unexpected. Compassion did not drain her. It nourished her. When she offered kindness, something within her settled. The ache in her chest remained, but it felt less like a wound and more like a well, deep, sensitive, and alive. She realized that compassion did not require her pain to disappear. It required her to stay connected to it without being consumed. This balance was delicate. There were days when she felt tired, when the stories of others pressed heavily against her heart. On those days, she returned to the practice she had learned, holding pain with kindness, starting with her own. She rested. She breathed. She allowed herself to step back when needed. Compassion, she learned, did not mean self-sacrifice. It meant honesty, knowing when to open and when to replenish. This understanding protected her from turning care into obligation. One evening, as she walked home after a long day, she felt the familiar ache rise again, stronger than it had been in weeks. Memories surfaced, sharp and vivid. For a moment, she feared she had lost ground. Then she noticed something else. Alongside the pain was gratitude. Not for the loss, not for the suffering, but for the capacity it had revealed within her. She saw how her heart had grown, not by avoiding pain, but by allowing it to teach her. She saw how the love she once poured into one life now flowed outward, touching many. Her child's life had not ended meaning. It had multiplied it. This realization did not sanctify loss. It did not make tragedy acceptable, but it transformed its aftermath. She began to understand compassion as wisdom in action. Wisdom saw the truth of suffering. Compassion responded without turning away. They were not separate qualities. They were two movements of the same heart. As she lay down to sleep that night, she placed her hand over her chest and felt the steady rhythm beneath her palm. The ache was there, gentle but present. She smiled faintly. "This pain connects me," she thought. "It reminds me that I belong." From personal grief, something vast had emerged. Not a mission, not a role, but a way of being. A way that met suffering with openness. A way that transformed isolation into connection. A way that allowed love to continue its work, even in the shadow of loss. Her journey was far from over. But now, she walked it not as a solitary figure weighed down by sorrow, but as a human being among human beings, carrying pain, offering presence, and discovering that compassion, once awakened, moves naturally from the heart that has suffered to the world that suffers still. Service did not begin with intention. It began with remembrance. The mother did not set out to transform her grief into action. She did not decide that loss must become purpose or that pain needed redemption. What happened was quieter than that. Love, having lost its original form, began to seek a new expression. At first, it was almost imperceptible. She noticed how often her thoughts returned to her child, not with the sharp urgency of longing, but with a gentle awareness. The love was still there, steady and unmistakable. And with it came a question that arose naturally, without force. Where can this love go now? She did not rush to answer it. In Buddhist understanding, wholesome action arises from clarity, not compulsion. She waited, listening inwardly, allowing the question to mature rather than demanding resolution. The answer, when it came, was simple. Serve life, not as a grand gesture, not as a replacement, but as an offering. Her first act of service was small, almost ordinary. A neighbor had fallen ill, leaving an elderly parent alone. Without much thought, the mother brought food, sat quietly, and listened. She did not speak of her own loss. She did not frame her presence as generosity. She simply showed up. As she sat there, watching steam rise from the bowl she had prepared, she felt something unexpected. Her heart was steady, not joyful, not relieved, but grounded. The ache in her chest was still present, but it no longer felt like a wound that demanded attention. It felt like a quiet companion, reminding her why she was there. Love was moving again. This experience stayed with her. She noticed how each act of care, no matter how small, created a subtle sense of alignment within her. As if something fractured by loss was slowly finding coherence through action. She began volunteering regularly, not because she believed it would heal her, but because it felt honest. She helped where help was needed, sometimes with words, often without them. She sat with those who were dying. She listened to those who felt forgotten. She supported families navigating their own forms of loss. Each encounter was different. Each story carried its own weight. And yet, beneath the variety, the same truth echoed. Life continued, fragile and precious, even in the presence of death. Serving life did not mean ignoring sorrow. It meant acknowledging it and responding anyway. There were moments when the pain resurfaced sharply, when a child's face reminded her too closely of her own, when laughter struck a chord that reopened old tenderness. In those moments, she paused. She breathed. She allowed the pain to be present. Then she continued. This was not endurance. It was devotion. In Buddhist teaching, right action flows naturally from right understanding. She understood now that her love had not ended with death. It had simply lost its familiar direction. Service gave it somewhere to land. She noticed how differently she experienced time now. Before, time had felt like an enemy, pulling her further from the last moment she had shared with her child. Now, time felt like a field of opportunity. Each day offered a chance to embody the values her love had cultivated. Care, patience, presence. This did not mean she was moving on. It meant she was moving with grief, with memory, with love. One afternoon, while assisting at a shelter, she met a young mother holding a frightened child. The child clung tightly, eyes wide, uncertain of the unfamiliar surroundings. The mother looked exhausted, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. Without thinking, the woman knelt to the child's level and spoke softly, offering reassurance not through promises, but through calm presence. The child relaxed slightly. As the woman stood up, emotion rose suddenly in her chest, sharp, immediate. For a moment, she felt as though the ground might give way beneath her. She stepped outside and sat down, breathing slowly. The pain was there, but it did not overwhelm her. She realized then that service did not protect her from pain. It did not shield her from reminders, but it gave her a way to meet those reminders with meaning rather than collapse. Her child's absence no longer felt like a void. It felt like a call. Not a call to replace, not a call to forget, but a call to live in a way that honored the depth of her love. She began to understand that death casts a long shadow, not only of grief, but of clarity. It strips away what is trivial. It reveals what matters. In that shadow, she saw life more clearly. She no longer postponed kindness. She no longer assumed time was abundant. She no longer took connection for granted. Each interaction felt precious, not because it might end, but because it was happening now. This awareness changed how she spoke, how she listened, how she touched the world. Service was no longer something she did. It was how she lived. There were still days of fatigue, Days when the weight of others' suffering pressed heavily against her heart. On those days, she returned to stillness. She rested. She allowed herself to be held by silence. Service did not require constant giving. It required sincerity. She learned to trust the rhythm, engaging when called, retreating when needed. This balance protected her from turning compassion into self-neglect. One evening, as she walked home beneath a sky streaked with fading light, she thought of her child, not with anguish, but with tenderness. "I'm still your mother," she thought, "and I am living." This thought did not feel like justification. It felt like truth. In Buddhist wisdom, the highest form of remembrance is not clinging to the past, but embodying what was most alive within it. She saw now that her love had shaped her capacity for care, and that capacity was now touching many lives. Her child's life had not ended in isolation. It continued through the ways she showed up for the world. This understanding did not erase grief. It dignified it. As she lay down to sleep that night, the familiar ache rested quietly in her chest. It no longer demanded explanation or resistance. It was simply there, a reminder of love, a guide toward compassion, a presence that walked with her as she served life, even in the shadow of death. And in that shadow, she discovered something enduring. That love, when freed from possession, does not diminish. It multiplies. For a long time, the mother believed love meant holding on, holding tightly, holding fiercely, holding as if release would mean disappearance. After loss, this belief had hardened into fear. If she loosened her grip on memory, on pain, on longing, she worried that love itself would dissolve, that her child would fade not only from the world, but from her heart. Now, slowly, she was discovering a deeper truth. Love did not need possession to survive. This realization did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded through countless quiet moments, through service, through presence, through the steady practice of allowing life to move as it would. She noticed a shift one evening while sitting alone at home. A memory of her child surfaced unexpectedly, a simple image of laughter, light and unburdened. For the first time, the memory did not pull her backward or tighten her chest with longing. It arose. It warmed her, and then it gently faded. She did not chase it. When she realized what had happened, tears came, not of pain, but of awe. The love was still there, even without grasping. She had spent so long believing that love required constant remembrance, constant ache, constant vigilance, that if she relaxed, love would weaken. But now she saw that love, when genuine, did not demand proof through suffering. It lived quietly. It endured without force. In Buddhist understanding, attachment is not love itself. It is the fear of loss that clings to love's form. She saw how often she had confused the two, how she had mistaken possession for devotion. Letting go of possession did not mean letting go of love. It meant letting love breathe. This shift changed how she related not only to her child, but to everything. She noticed it in her relationships. She listened without trying to control outcomes. She cared without needing reassurance. She gave attention freely, without expecting permanence in return. This did not make her distant or indifferent. It made her more present. When she was with others, she was truly there, not distracted by fear of future loss or anxiety about change. She met each moment as it arose, knowing it would pass, and valuing it precisely because of that. Impermanence no longer felt like a threat. It felt like context. She began to understand that love is not diminished by change. It is revealed by it. Her child's life had been brief, but it had been complete. Complete in its capacity to awaken love, to shape her heart, to open her to the world in ways she could never have imagined before. The love did not belong to her in the way objects belong. It had moved through her, and now it continued to move. This understanding softened something deep within her. She no longer needed to rehearse grief to keep love alive. She no longer needed pain to validate devotion. She trusted that love, once awakened, does not vanish when its object changes form. One afternoon, while walking beneath a wide sky, she felt a sudden sense of closeness, not to memory, not to image, but to presence, as if love had expanded beyond a single point and now filled the space around her. She breathed deeply. "I do not have to hold you," she thought gently. "You're already part of me." This was not resignation. It was freedom. Freedom from the exhausting effort of holding on. Freedom from the fear that love required suffering to remain real. She realized how much energy she had spent guarding pain, afraid that without it, something sacred would be lost. Now she saw that pain had been a teacher, not a requirement. The teaching was complete. Love could remain without clinging. Connection could exist without control. In Buddhist wisdom, this is the flowering of non-attachment, not cold detachment, but warm, spacious love unbound by fear. She was beginning to live this truth not as philosophy, but as lived experience. This did not mean she stopped missing her child. The longing still arose at times, quiet and tender, but it no longer demanded possession. It no longer insisted that things be otherwise. She missed without resisting reality. She loved without needing to grasp. This balance felt fragile at first. She wondered if it would last, if the old patterns would return. But with time, she learned to trust the spaciousness that had opened within her. Love, she discovered, did not shrink when released. It expanded. It touched strangers. It guided her actions. It shaped her response to suffering, her own and others. Her child was no longer the center she clung to. Her child was the doorway through which her heart had learned to open. This realization did not diminish the bond. It honored it. As she reflected on this, she saw how much her understanding of love had changed. Before, love had felt fragile, dependent on circumstances. Now it felt resilient, not because it controlled life, but because it flowed with it. She could love without fear of loss, not because loss would not happen, but because love did not end with it. This truth brought a quiet peace, not a dramatic calm, but a steady one. A peace that could coexist with sorrow, memory, and longing without being overwhelmed by them. That evening, as she prepared for sleep, she felt the familiar ache in her chest. It was softer now, less insistent. She rested her hand there and smiled faintly. "I'm still loving," she thought, "and I am free." Loving without possession did not mean loving less. It meant loving fully, without fear, without clinging, without demanding that life remain unchanged. This was wisdom born of loss, and compassion matured through understanding. And as she drifted into rest, she felt something she had not felt in a long time, a sense of trust, not in permanence, but in love's ability to endure. Even when everything else transforms, peace did not arrive as silence. It arrived as space. For a long time, the mother had imagined peace as the absence of pain, a clean horizon where grief no longer cast its shadow. She had believed that if peace ever came, it would mean the end of sorrow, the closing of a chapter she had not chosen to open. But the peace that began to settle within her was different. It did not erase grief. It learned to live beside it. She noticed this one morning as she sat quietly, watching light move across the floor. The ache in her chest was there, familiar and steady. And yet, her breath was calm. Her body was relaxed. Her thoughts moved slowly, without urgency. Both things existed at once. Sorrow and ease, loss and presence. The realization surprised her. She had spent so long believing that pain and peace were opposites, that one must disappear for the other to arise. Now she saw that this belief had been another form of resistance, another attempt to impose order on an experience that did not obey such divisions. In Buddhist understanding, peace is not the absence of suffering, it is the absence of struggle with suffering. She was beginning to understand this, not as an idea, but as a felt truth. The days no longer felt like battles. They unfolded with a quiet rhythm. Some moments were heavy, others were light. Many were simply ordinary. She met them as they came, without bracing, without clinging. When waves of grief rose, she did not panic. She did not ask why they had returned or worry that she was regressing. She knew now that sorrow moved in cycles like weather. It comes, it stays, it passes. Peace was not found by chasing away the storm, but by learning how to stand beneath it without being swept away. She noticed how this understanding changed her inner landscape. There was less tension, less self-judgment, less urgency to be better or healed. Healing, she realized, was not a destination. It was a relationship with pain, memory, and love, one that evolved over time. She still missed her child deeply. Certain dates stirred old tenderness. Certain places brought memories into sharp focus. The loss had not faded into abstraction. But now, when the pain arose, it did not consume her entire being. It did not collapse her into the past or project her endlessly into an imagined future. She could feel sorrow and still notice the warmth of sunlight. She could cry and still hear birdsong. She could ache and still breathe fully. This capacity to hold opposing experiences without tearing felt like a quiet miracle. She thought back to earlier days when grief had demanded exclusivity, when pain had insisted on being the only thing present. Now, pain shared space with other experiences, not because it had diminished, but because her heart had expanded. Peace, she discovered, was spacious. It allowed sorrow to exist without making it the whole story. This peace did not dull her emotions. It sharpened her awareness. She felt things more clearly now, not only grief, but gratitude, tenderness, and subtle joy. One afternoon, she laughed unexpectedly at something small and ordinary. The sound startled her. It rose naturally, without permission, and faded just as gently. For a moment, guilt flickered. Then it passed. Joy no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like life continuing to express itself. She understood now that peace did not require her to choose between honoring loss and embracing life. It asked her to do both. This understanding brought a deep sense of balance. She could remember without drowning. She could move forward without forgetting. In Buddhist teaching, equanimity is the ability to remain steady amidst change, to allow experiences to arise and pass without being pulled apart by them. She felt this quality growing within her, quietly and organically. Equanimity was not indifference. It was intimacy without entanglement. She was intimate with her sorrow, aware of its texture, its depth, its rhythms. But she was no longer entangled in the belief that sorrow defined her entire existence. She noticed how this steadiness influenced her interactions with others. When people spoke of their pain, she did not absorb it as her own, nor did she distance herself from it. She listened fully, offering presence without losing her center. This balance protected her compassion from becoming overwhelming. She had learned that peace did not mean closing her heart. It meant anchoring it in awareness, in breath, in the present moment. On evenings when loneliness returned strongly, she sat quietly with it, noticing its contours. She did not rush to fill the space with noise or distraction. She allowed the silence to be what it was. Sometimes the silence felt heavy. Sometimes it felt tender. Sometimes it felt neutral. She no longer assigned meaning to these states. She allowed them to come and go. In this allowing, peace deepened. One night, as rain fell softly outside, she lay awake listening to its steady rhythm. The ache in her chest pulsed gently, in time with her breath. She felt both the weight of loss and the comfort of being alive, breathing, present. Tears came, not sharp, not desperate, but quiet, releasing something old. She smiled faintly in the darkness. This is peace, she realized. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of gentleness. Peace that does not demand forgetting. Peace that does not fear pain. Peace that allows love to remain tender without clinging. This peace felt honest. It did not pretend that life was fair or predictable. It did not promise immunity from future loss. It simply offered a way to meet whatever came with openness and steadiness. She understood now that the heart could be both broken and whole at the same time. broken open, whole in awareness. This understanding brought humility. She no longer felt the need to define her experience for others or to present herself as healed. She allowed her story to remain unfinished, evolving, alive. Peace did not freeze her in a final state. It flowed with her life. As weeks passed, this peace settled deeper, becoming less noticeable because it was always there, like the ground beneath her feet. She trusted it, not as a shield against pain, but as a companion within it. Her child's absence remained a part of her story, but it no longer overshadowed every moment. It existed alongside laughter, service, rest, and quiet contentment. She could hold memory and presence together. This was the peace that coexists with sorrow, a peace that does not erase loss, but dignifies it, a peace that allows love to continue, without fear, without possession, without struggle. And in this peace, she felt something deeply reassuring, that her heart, having been shattered by loss, had learned not how to close, but how to stay open, wide enough to hold grief and grace, side by side, without choosing between them. In the end, the mother did not emerge from her journey carrying answers. She carried something quieter and far more enduring. Her tears remained, but they had changed. Once, her tears had fallen in isolation, heavy with questions and resistance. They had marked the boundaries of her suffering, drawing a circle around a pain she believed no one else could enter. Now, when tears came, they flowed from a different place. They no longer asked to be explained. They offered themselves as testimony. They said, "This is love." They said, "This is what it means to be human." She noticed this transformation on an ordinary afternoon. She was sitting with a small group of people, some grieving, some simply weary from life's quiet burdens. No one had asked her to speak. No one expected wisdom. And yet, when the moment came, she found herself sharing, not the details of her loss, but the truth of what it had taught her. "I didn't stop loving," she said softly. "I just stopped trying to own what I loved." The room fell silent. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Her words were not instructions. They were reflections offered gently, without insistence. And in that stillness, something moved among those listening, a recognition that did not require agreement. Later, as people left one by one, several paused to thank her. Not for advice, not for comfort, but for honesty. "You made it feel possible," one person said quietly, "to keep living with an open heart." The mother walked home that evening beneath a sky washed clean by fading light. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, soft, steady, present. It did not demand attention. It accompanied her like a memory that had learned how to breathe. She understood then that her journey had never been about overcoming grief. It had been about allowing grief to complete its work. Grief had broken her open. Compassion had grown in the opening. Wisdom had taken root in compassion. And now, without effort, what had grown within her began to offer itself outward. This was not a mission she chose. It was a consequence of truth lived deeply. In Buddhist understanding, the deepest teachings are not transmitted through words alone. They are embodied. They are felt in presence, in tone, in the way one meets the world without armor. She had become such a teaching, not because she sought it, but because she had walked through suffering without closing her heart. Her tears had become a gift, not because they were beautiful, but because they were real. They carried the message that pain could be met without hatred, that loss could be honored without clinging, that love could endure without possession. She saw now how often the world urged people to hide their sorrow, to move on quickly, to be resilient at the cost of honesty. Her presence offered something different, a permission to grieve without shame, to heal without forgetting, to live without pretending. She did not speak often of her child. When she did, she spoke simply with tenderness rather than urgency. She no longer felt the need to prove the depth of her love through suffering. The love was evident in how she lived, patient, attentive, open. Her child's life had not ended her motherhood. It had transformed it. She was still a mother, not holding a body, but holding a way of loving. This way of loving touched strangers, neighbors, and those she served. It appeared in her listening, in her restraint from judgment, in her willingness to remain present when others wanted to turn away. She had learned that compassion does not require strength as the world defines it. It requires vulnerability sustained by understanding. There were still moments when grief returned sharply. Unexpected anniversaries, sudden memories, quiet evenings when absence felt louder than presence. In those moments, she allowed herself to feel. She did not rush to spiritualize pain or smooth it into meaning. She cried when tears came. She rested when weariness arrived. She returned to stillness when the world felt too heavy. This honesty protected the gift her tears had become. It kept her grounded in truth rather than image. Over time, people began to seek her out, not because she claimed authority, but because she embodied permission. Permission to be unfinished. Permission to be tender. Permission to let sorrow and peace share the same breath. She never called herself wise. She simply stayed present. And presence, she discovered, was the rarest offering. One evening, as she sat alone, she thought of her child, not as a wound, but as a presence that had shaped her capacity to love. She felt gratitude rise, not for the loss, but for the love that had been awakened through it. "I am living," she whispered, "and I am loving." The words felt complete. In Buddhist teaching, awakening is not an escape from the world. It is an intimacy with it, an unguarded participation in life as it is impermanent and precious. She had not sought awakening, but through suffering, she had learned how to stay awake. Her tears no longer marked the limits of her endurance. They marked the depth of her compassion. They were no longer a private language of despair. They were a universal language of connection. And so, without fanfare, without declaration, her journey came full circle, not to an ending, but to an offering. A mother's tears, once heavy with resistance, now clear with understanding, fell into the world and watered the ground of compassion. Where they touched, hearts softened. Where they landed, courage grew. This was her legacy, not a story of loss overcome, but a life lived open, in the presence of loss. Not an answer to suffering, but a response to it. And in that response, quiet, steady, and true, her tears became a gift to the world, teaching without words that even the deepest sorrow can give rise to wisdom, and that love, when freed from fear, never truly ends.